The summer sunlight filtered soft gold through the climbing white roses strung across the metal wedding arch at Willow Creek Gardens, the air thick with the sweet tang of peony bouquets and the quiet murmur of 200 seated guests. Ilara Voss stood barefoot on warm Kentucky bluegrass, the hem of her custom lace wedding dress brushing the lawn, her fingers trembling slightly where they curled around a cream satin bouquet. 34 years old, a graphic designer who'd spent months hand-drawing every detail of this second wedding, she'd spent her whole life chasing the quiet, steady marriage her parents had never managed to give her. All week she'd brushed off tiny, nagging twinges of unease about her groom Kyle, telling herself his constant phone checking was only stress from wrapping a commercial construction project before their ceremony. Today was supposed to erase every lingering doubt. Kyle stood a foot away, broad shoulders squared in a tailored navy suit, his jaw set in the easy, charming smile that had pulled her in 2 years prior. His left hand hung loose at his side, but his right was tucked deep in his suit jacket pocket, thumb tapping rapid, nervous rhythms against the screen of his cell phone hidden there. Ilara caught the faint glow seeping through the fabric once, and she almost asked if something at work had gone wrong, but the officiant cleared his throat to begin the vow, and she pushed the thought aside. This was their fresh start. She'd refused a prenuptial agreement months back, convinced trust meant laying every fear down for the man she planned to build a home with. The officiant's gentle voice rolled over the crowd as he recited the opening blessing, and Ilara's gaze locked with Kale, ready to pour every ounce of relief and love into their exchange. Before either of them could speak their promises, a sharp, groaning metal shriek split the calm air, the heavy steel arch anchoring all the floral garlands buckled inward without warning, its central support beam snapping clean through. Ilara barely had time to register the shadow hurtling toward her, before the jagged, exposed edge of the steel crashed hard into the crown of her skull. White lace tore instantly under the weight of the falling straw, and she crumpled backward onto the grass, her bouquet scattering peonies across the dirt beside her. Hot, thick blood flooded down her forehead, soaking the ivory fabric of her wedding dress in dark, spreading crimson splotches that blurred her vision. A high, ringing hum filled her ears, drowning out the sudden screams of the guests as they surged to their chairs scraping against the lawn in pain exploded behind her eyes, sharp and unwilling, and she reached blindly for Kale's hand, desperate for him to kneel down, to press a towel to her wound, to call for. Her fingers found Emmer. Through blurring, blood-streaked lashes, she watched him freeze for half a minute, his eyes darting not to her crumpled, bleeding arm, but to the phone he'd pulled from his jacket. The screen lit his face in harsh and Ilara caught a flash of a name she didn't recognize before his face drained of all. A short, sharp gasp escaped him, no sound of concern for her, only raw panic for whatever message had just landed on his screen. He didn't call out to the staff, didn't drop to his knees to check if she was, didn't even shout for someone to dial 9. He took one quick step forward, then spun on his heel and bolted for the gravel parking lot at the edge garden. Ilara. But the word came out as a gurgled whisper, blood seeping. Her limbs heavy, her grip on consciousness slipping fast as the blood pooled beneath her shoulders, staining the grass red. She watched his navy suit jacket flash between rows of chests, watched him yank open the driver's side door of his beat-up silver pickup truck without a single back. The engine roared to life later, tires kicking up gravel as he peeled out of the lot, accelerating down the 2-lane county highway until his truck shrank to a tiny silver speck on the chased him. All eyes fixed on her, the bride left broken and bleeding in her. A woman from the church women's circle scrambled forward with a napkin, pressing it hard to her scalp, but the fabric soaked through in seconds. Ilara's best friend Jessa tore through next, her elementary school teacher's tote bag slung over one shoulder, her voice cracking as she knelt beside her and pressed her palm to a leak. Sirens wailed far in the distance, growing loud by the second, the high piercing tone cutting through the sobs and hushed, horrified whispers rippling through wedding guests. He left, Jessa breathed, tears dripping onto Ilara's bloodied cheek, her voice tight with rage. He just got in his truck and drove away and left you here. The ringing in her ears swelled to a deafening roar, the world tilting sideways as the blood loss dragged her toward blackness. Last clear thought, sharp and cold beneath crushing pain, tangled around the image of Kaylee's pickup, the unknown name glowing on his phone screen. Whatever woman he'd raced off to save mattered to him than me. Even as I lay dying in the dress I'd sewn our life together. Paramedics burst through the garden's wood 8 minutes later, boots crunching over fallen rose petals and core. They lifted her onto a rigid backboard, securing a thick pressure bandage over her head wound as they murmured urgent medical jargon back and forth, lifting her off the grass and sliding her into the back of a waiting ambulance. The door slammed shut with a heavy thud, sealing her away from the crowd of gawking guests and the shattered metal arch that had split her perfect wedding day apart. The ambulance's heart monitor clicked beside her head, a steady, staccato beep marking her fading pulse as they pulled away Willow Creek Gardens, rushing her toward the downtown ICU 30 minutes away. No one's destination. No one knew where he'd gone, abandoned her for. As the world faded to gray around her, Ella clung to the single, brutal truth into her bones. The man who'd promised to stand by sickness and in health had chosen to run the second her sickness threatened to inconvenience him. If she slipped away on this ambulance ride, He would never even know how close he'd come watching her die alone, her white wedding dress soaked through with her own blood. The sterile hum of the ICU monitor was the first sound that pulled Alara back to awareness, 72 hours after the wedding collapse. Her skull throbbed with a slow, grinding pain that pulsed in time with the beeping machine beside her bed, and every small shift of her neck sent a wave of nausea rolling up her throat. Heavy medical gauze wrapped tight around the crown of her head, secured with scratchy medical tape that pulled at her raw skin whenever she blinked too hard. The thin hospital gown they dressed her in hung loose off her shoulders, a stark contrast to the lace wedding dress soaked through with her blood that still sat folded in a plastic evidence bag tucked in the closet by the door. Sunlight slanted through narrow vertical windows, shifting from pale morning gold to muted afternoon gray as the hours blurred together without Cale's presence. Jessa had barely left her side since the paramedics wheeled her into the unit, sneaking overnight naps in the hard plastic waiting room chair, bringing lukewarm hospital coffee and soft fruit cups from the cafeteria, scrolling through endless news feeds and wedding group chats to shield Alara from the gossip spreading through their small suburban Ohio town. Every time Alara's eyes fluttered open, Jessa was there, gripping her cold hand, wiping dried blood crust from her cheeks, speaking in quiet, gentle tones to keep her grounded through the fog of pain medication. No other visitors arrived. No bouquet of flowers delivered to the nurse's station under Cale's name. No short apologetic text lighting up Alara's locked cell phone sitting on the rolling tray beside her IV stand. No missed calls or voicemails waiting when Jessa unlocked the screen to show her. For 3 full days, Cale existed only as a ghost haunting every quiet moment between Alara's fits of restless sleep. Nurses stopped by every hour to check her vitals, adjust her IV drip, change her bandages, and each time Alara forced herself to ask if anyone matching Cale's description had come looking for her. Each nurse's slow, pitying shake of the head carved another hollow space inside her chest. By the second afternoon of her confinement, Jessa could no longer keep the wedding's social media aftermath hidden from her. She hesitated for a long minute before handing Alara her phone, pulling up the public photo album one of their church acquaintances had posted online. The screen filled with chaotic snapshots, captured seconds after the steel arch. Alara crumpled on the grass, white gown stained dark. Guests screaming and scrambling backward, and a blurry, unmissable shot of Cale's navy suit retreating fast toward the front. His head bowed, phone clutched tight in one hand. Alara stared at the image for minutes without, her fingers trembling as she zoomed in on his rush aim, searching for any hint of hesitation or regret in his gesture. Then, scrolling further down the comment section, unlocked the secret name Jessa had been hiding from her for Lila. A guest's offhand text screenshot had been shared across the groups, a panicked message sent to one of Cale's construction co-workers minutes before the begging Cale to rush to Lila's apartment because she'd swallowed a bottle of anti-anxiety. The words blurred behind Alara's stinging tears as she pieced. Cale had received that desperate alert mid-ceremony, watched her collapse under Jess's deal, and chosen a stranger's overdose crisis over stopping to call an ambulance for his bleeding bride. Self-blame coiled tight in her stomach, sharp and bitter. She replayed every tiny warning sign she'd brushed off in the months leading up. Cale sneaking outside to take private phone call dinner. Vague excuses about last-minute work trip town. His refusal to let her glance at his cell phone screen even once. She'd told herself she was overthinking, that his distance was only stress from his struggling business, that love meant trusting him without demands. Now every small avoidance felt like a brit lie, strung together to hide the affair unfolding right under her nose. Jessa sat on the edge of the hospital bed, squeezing Alara's hand hard enough to ground her through the spiral of guilt and grief. She told Alara plainly that none of her fault, that no amount of careful compromise or quiet patience could fix a man who abandoned his injured wife at their own wedding to race to another. But Alara couldn't shake the thought that if she'd pushed hard honesty, if she'd insisted on boundaries instead of swallowing every doubt, she might never have ended up alone in a U-bed, fighting to recover from a traumatic head wound, while her groom vanished with a single check-in. Late on the third day, as dusk painted the hospital windows soft purple, the front desk called the ICU using station, their voice crackling over the intercom system that hung on the wall. But the nurse stepped into the room a minute later, her expression tight and uneasy as edge. Cale Voss had just pulled his silver pickup truck into the lot. He was signed in at the front desk, carrying a small paper bag and a wilting bouquet of store roses, asking for immediate access to a room. Alara's chest twisted into a tangled mess of conflicting emotion the second the nurse finished speaking. Part of her ached desperate an explanation, some reasonable, forgivable circumstance that could soften the brutal reality of his abandonment. Another, colder part of her already knew there was no excuse heavy enough to erase the image of herself bleeding on the wet lawn while he fled. She lay back against the raised hospital pillows, her gaze fixed on the closed ICU hallway door, waiting to see what half-hearted apology he would manufacture to make her overlook the fact he'd left her fighting for her life alone for 3 endless days. The sound of rubber sneakers squeaking against linoleum echoed down the ICU hallway long before Cale stepped into view. Alara kept her eyes locked on the thin crack beneath her closed room door, listening to his uneven footsteps slow as he neared her private suite. The crinkle of a plastic flower bag loud in the silent, sterile corridor. Her heart hammered hard against her bruised ribcage, a chaotic mix of rage, fragile hope and crippling fear swirling through her still foggy mind. She hadn't decided if she wanted to scream at him, demand every hidden truth, or simply tell him to leave and never come back. Before she could settle on a single thought, a firm, calm female voice cut through the quiet, stopping Cale cold outside her doorway. Dr. Mara Hale, Alara's attending ICU physician, stood directly in front of Cale, blocking the entrance to Alara's room entirely. The doctor's white coat hung crisp over her dark scrub, her arms folded tight across her chest, her sharp brown eyes fixed unblinkingly on Kyle's disheveled frame. He'd clearly not slept in 72 hours. Dark purple circles pooled beneath his eyes, his dress shirt wrinkled and unbuttoned at the collar. The cheap bouquet of roses he clutched already drooping, petals shedding onto the hospital floor at his feet. The small paper grocery bag in his free hand crumpled as he shifted his weight, a half-empty box of chocolate truffles peeking out over the edge. Cale tried to step around Dr. Mara, his voice rough and rushed, thick with what he believed was genuine remorse. He mumbled Alara's name, explaining he needed to see her immediately, that he'd been trapped dealing with an emergency he could not ignore, that he'd spent every waking minute consumed with guilt over what happened at the wedding. Dr. Mara did not move an inch to let him pass, her tone flat and unyielding, no trace of the gentle bedside manner she used when speaking to Alara. 3 days, Dr. Mara said slowly, each word heavy enough to hang in the air between. For 72 hours, this woman lay in this ICU alone, fighting severe traumatic brain, repeated blood pressure spikes from massive blood loss, 2 overnight medical code scares when her vital signs dropped dangerously low. Her best friend slept in a waiting room chair to monitor her while you vanished entirely. You did not call, you did not text, you did not send staff to check on her condition. You did not once confirm she was alive until... Cale's jawed, his brief show of remorse cracking fast into defensive frustration. He lifted his hands in a helpless gesture, arguing Lila's overdose had been lightning, that her roommate had called him screaming that she wasn't breathing, that he'd had no choice but to rush to her apartment to administer first aid and call her personal doctor. He insisted Alara was surrounded by 200 wedding guests who could dial 911, that she had been stable left, that he assumed paramedics would arrive within minutes to care for her wounds. He framed his abandonment as an unavoidable split-second decision between 2 people facing life or death, refusing to acknowledge he'd wasted their lives and chosen the other woman without a single glance back at his blood. Dr. Mara let him finish his rambling defense without interruption, her expression cold and wavering. When Cale fell silent, waiting for her to step aside and grant him access to a room, she leaned forward slightly, her voice low and razor-sharp, the iconic line landing hard enough that Alara heard every syllable clear through the cracked door. She needs a eulogy. Cale frowned completely, the roses slipping slightly in his grip as he stared at the doctor in stunned. He tried to argue again, stammering that Alara, that he planned to spend the rest of his life making amends for his mistake, that he deserved a chance to apologize. Dr. shook her head, telling him Alara's mental and physical recovery depended entirely on eliminating the source of her catastrophic trauma. She explained the hospital had already filed a temporary visitor restriction at Alara's request, and he would not be permitted inside her room for any reason until she personally lifted the ban. Frustration boiled over Kyle then, his carefully constructed remorse discarded to reveal the self. He accused Dr. Mara of overstepping personal boundaries, of taking sides in a personal marital dispute that had nothing to do with her. He slammed the bag of chocolates down on a nearby plastic waiting room chair, sending a few truffles rolling across the linoleum floor, and tossed the wilted roses on them. He shouted that this entire situation was unfair, that he'd only acted to save a vulnerable woman's life, and no one was willing to listen to her. The raised volume of his voice echoed straight to Alara's room, each sharp, defensive word slicing through the fragile clung to, that he held even a shred of regret for leaving her lead unattended. She pressed a palm-bandaged scalp, fresh pain flaring behind her eyes as she realized Cale viewed near-death injury as a minor inconvenience stacked against crisis, not a life-altering trauma he'd directly abandoned to endure alone. After several more minutes of fruitless arguing, Cale threw one last bitter glare at Dr. Mara, spun on his heel, and stormed down the ICU hallway exit. His heavy footsteps faded fast, followed by the distant slam of the main entrance doors. Dr. Mara waited a full minute to ensure he was truly gone before tapping lightly on Alara's bedroom door, stepping inside. Her sharp expression softened into quiet sympathy as she pulled a chair beside the hospital bed. Alara did not speak, her gaze fixed on the discarded roses and chocolates visible through the window to the door. The flowers he'd brought as a peace offering lay abandoned, wilting and forgotten, just as she had been 3 days prior. Gardens. A hollow, numb grief deep in her bones, heavier than the pain of her head wound. She reached for her phone on the rolling tray, her thumb hovering over Kyle's contact profile, ready to cut every line of communication with them for good. Jessa arrived back at the ICU an hour after Kyle stormed out, carrying a leather satchel stuffed with personal belongings she'd retrieved from the wedding venue's lost and found office. Inside the bag sat Kyle's unlocked cell phone, dropped in the grass the second he'd sprinted for his pickup truck after the arch collapsed. Jessa had grabbed it for safekeeping, unsure if Alara would ever want to look through its contents. But she set the device on the rolling tray beside Alara's IV line without hesitation, sensing the time had come for Alara to uncover the full truth of Cale's months-long deception. Alara's fingers trembled as she picked up the black smartphone, swiping the screen awake without a passcode to block her access. The lock screen background was a photo of Lila May, not Alara's wedding portraits they'd printed together the week prior. A cold wave of nausea washed over her as she scrolled open his text message threads, sorting through hundreds of hidden conversations hidden under a generic construction supply contact label to avoid her suspicion. Every chat log laid bare the affair's brutal timeline, stretching back 6 full months before their wedding date, long before Alara had even walked down the garden aisle to exchange vows with him. She read through late-night messages Cale had sent Lila from their shared marital home, texts typed out while Alara slept soundly in the bedroom beside him. He'd complained endlessly about Alara's quiet need for stability, mocked her graphic design business as a trivial hobby that drained his mental energy, promised Lila repeatedly he planned to leave Alara immediately after their wedding ceremony concluded. He'd booked secret hotel rooms an hour outside town for overnight trysts, under the excuse of late construction site inspections, borrowed cash from his business partners to pay for Lila's therapy bills and expensive anxiety medication, all while hiding mounting unpaid construction debts from Alara entirely. Screenshots of suicidal text threats littered the conversation thread. Messages Lila had sent Cale for months leading up to the wedding day overdose. She'd repeatedly threatened to harm herself if Cale chose to follow through with marrying Alara, manipulating him into constant check-ins, secret visits, and financial support to calm her spiraling anxiety. Kyle's responses revealed he'd spent months prioritizing Lila's fragile mental state over addressing the clear cracks forming in his engagement to Alara, never once considering ending the affair or being honest about his dual lives before the wedding day disaster forced everything into the open. Midway through scrolling the texts, Alara's cell phone buzzed with an incoming video call from Clara Voss, Cale's 62-year-old mother. She'd grown close to Clara in the year leading up to bonding over shared love of home gardening and small-town communities, and Alara had always believed her mother-in-law saw her as the steady, loyal partner Cale desperately. She hesitated before accepting all, propping the phone up on a pillow beside her, bracing herself for comfort or support from the one family member she'd thought she could. Clara's face filled the screen the second the connection stayed, her expression tight with frustration before Alara could even. She launched straight into a defense of her son's actions, repeating every hollow excuse Cale had parroted to Dr. Mara hours. She insisted Lila's overdose had been a genuine life-or-death emergency, that Cale had acted out of basic humanity, that Alara was overreacting by holding a single split-second decision against him and refusing to hear his apologies. She pressed Alara to consider reconciling once she recovered physically, arguing every marriage faced mistakes were forgiving, and that Alara risked ruining her reputation within their tight church by publicly cutting ties with Cale over one terrible. Alara listened silently through the entire lecture, her chest growing colder with every biased word Clara spoke. Her mother-in-law did not ask once about Alara's traumatic injury, did not acknowledge the 72 hours Alara spent alone in care, did not pause to consider how terrifying it was to be abandoned mid-life-threatening accident by the man who swore to protect her. Clara's only concern was shielding Cale from judgment and preserving the family's social standing in their neighborhood, with zero regard for Alara's physical and. When Alara spoke, her voice thin and exhausted from days of pain medication, she told Clara plainly she could not entertain reconciliation while Cale hid a 6-month-long affair and abandoned her to nearly bleed out. Clara's face hardened instantly, arguing Alara was too stubborn to accept perfection, before abruptly ending the video call without a single kind word or well-wish for Alara's recovery. The screen cut to black, and Alara set her phone down beside Cale's device. The warm mother-in-law bond she'd cherished fully shattered in one brief conversation. Dr. Mara stopped by an hour later to complete her vitals check. Noticing Alara's red, swollen eyes and the discarded smartphone resting on the tray, she chair close, sharing fragments of her own marriage trauma, how her ex-husband had abandoned her in the ER during a ruptured emergency to rush comfort a female coworker experience. Her shared experience gave Alara a quiet, unsure validation that her rage and betrayal had overblown, that no partner who truly loved her would ever prioritize another person's crisis over her life-threatening injury. By late night, Alara had processed enough of Cale's hidden lies to reach a final decision. She typed out a short, firm text to Cale's number, telling him he was banned from all hospital visits permanently, demanding he cease all attempts to contact her via phone, text, or third-party family members. Second the message sent, she navigated to her contact settings and blocked his number entirely, severing their direct line of communication with hesitation. Minutes after the block took effect, a new unknown private number popped up on her phone screen, delivering a single attached photograph with no accompanying message. Alara tapped to expand the image, her throat. The photo captured Lila May sitting in the passenger seat of Cale's silver pickup truck the exact evening Alara went to the ICU, the same vehicle he'd fled the wedding garden in while Alara on the grass. 48 hours after the anonymous photo arrived in Alara's text inbox, Jessa wheeled her down to the hospital main lobby coffee shop for a brief change of scenery away from the 4 white walls of the ICU room. Her head wound still ached sharply if she walked too far without pausing, and she leaned heavily on Jessa's arm as they crossed the linoleum lobby, the faint smell of burnt coffee and sanitizer hanging thick in the air. Alara had hoped the short trip might clear the fog of constant grief clouding her mind, but her chest tightened the second she spotted a thin, anxious young woman lingering by the vending machines near the front glass doors. It was Lila May, the woman from Cale's phone lock screen, the passenger in the anonymous pickup truck photo. Stood twisting a crumpled paper tissue between her fingers, her shoulders hunched inward like she expected anger or screaming the second Alara laid eyes on her. She clutched a thick manila file folder pressed tight to her chest, her eyes glistening with nervous tears as she locked gazes with Alara across the quiet lobby. Jessa immediately stepped forward, positioning herself between Alara and Lila as a protective barrier, her posture rigid and ready to step in if the conversation turned hostile or aggressive. Lila hesitated for several long seconds before slowly crossing the lobby toward, her steps small and tentative. No trace of the manipulative confidence Alara had read in her months of text messages to Cale. She apologized before Alara could utter a single word, her voice shaky and quiet, explaining she'd only learned the full extent of Alara's injuries and 3 days of solitary ICU confinement that morning. Cale had lied to her relentlessly for 72 hours following the wedding arch collapse, claiming Alara had escaped the accident with only minor scrapes and bruises, staying at home with family while he tended to Lila's overdose recovery. Lila had no idea Alara had nearly died from blood, no knowledge of the traumatic brain injury requiring critical, no understanding Cale had abandoned his bleeding bride without summoning emergency. Alara listened without interruption, the rage she'd carried toward Lila for weeks softening into a heavy, weary sorrow as the younger woman laid out her own codependent trap with. Lila admitted she'd grown reliant on Cale's constant attention and financial support over the 6 months. Her chronic anxiety leaving her desperate for any steady source of validation, even if it came from a man already engaged to another woman. She genuinely believed Cale's repeated promises to leave Alara post-wedding, convinced their secret relationship would transition into an official, stable partnership once the ceremony concluded. She'd never intended to become the reason a wedding day turned catastrophic, never imagined her overdose crisis would push Cale to abandon Alara to life-threatening. Jessa relaxed her protective stance slightly as Lila spoke, though she remained close enough to intervene if tension. Alara lowered herself onto one of the plastic lobby counters, gesturing for Lila to sit across the small table from her, determined to hear every unfiltered truth before passing final judgment on the other woman, tangled up in Cale's web of lies. Lila set the manila folder down on the table surface between them, sliding it across to Alara's hands, explaining it contained every single saved text message, hotel receipt, and handwritten note Cale had sent her throughout their stay. She wanted Alara to have complete, unedited proof of every promise and lie Cale had manufactured to keep both women trapped in his. As Alara flipped open the folder to scan the stack of papers inside, a folded slip of notebook paper slipped out from between printed text and shots. It was a handwritten note in Cale's handwriting, dated the week before their wedding ceremony, a direct promise to Lila that he planned to file for separation and move into her apartment within 7 days of exchanging with Alara. The words burned into Alara's vision as she processed their meaning. Cale had never intended to build a long life with her at all. The entire wedding, every floral arrangement Alara had on for months, every shared home renovation plan they'd mapped out together, had only been a temporary performance while he waited for the chance to move in with his mistress. Lila watched Alara's face when she read the note, fresh tears spilling down her own cheeks as she swore she intended to cut all contact with Cale permanently the second she left the hospital lobby that afternoon. She admitted she'd realized during her overdose recovery how toxic and one-sided her reliance had become, how his constant dishonesty and shifting priorities were slowly worsening her anxiety instead of calming it. She planned to block his phone number, return everything he'd purchased for her, and seek independent therapy to break free of the codependent cycle they'd fallen into together, refusing to be another tool Cale used to avoid confronting failures. Alara closed the manila folder and slid it into Jessa's bag for safekeeping, accepting Lila's genuine apology without lashing out or penance. She recognized they were both casualties of Cale's coward endless deception, 2 women manipulated into competing for a man who had no intention of committing either of them. The bitter rivalry Alara had imagined feeling toward Lila dissolved entirely, replaced by a quiet, shared grief for the separate futures they'd both lost to Cale's refusal to face the truth. Lila stood from the cafe chair, their conversation wrapped, offering one final quiet apology before turning to walk out the hospital's glass front doors, cut every tie to Cale, and rebuild her life independent of his influence. Alara watched her retreating frame disappear into the afternoon parking lot sunlight, her mind replaying the handwritten promise tucked inside the folder resting in Jessa's bag. 3 more days passed before Alara's medical team cleared her for hospital discharge, her head wound stable enough to manage with at-home wound care and regular follow-up neurology appointments. Her physical recovery remained incomplete. Bright lights triggered splitting migraines, sudden loud noises sent sharp stabs of pain through her skull, and exhaustion weighed her down after even short stretches of conversation. But Dr. Mara confirmed the critical ICU monitoring phase had concluded, and Alara could continue healing in a private living space away from hospital walls. Jessa arrived at checkout time with a spare canvas duffel bag, ready to collect Alara's minimal belongings, including the blood-stained wedding dress sealed inside a clear plastic hospital evidence bag from the wedding venue accident. Before Alara could sign her discharge paperwork, the pastor from their neighborhood church stepped into the hospital lobby, seeking a private conversation with her to discuss the wedding's fallout spreading through the congregation. He pulled her aside into a quiet, empty waiting room, his tone gentle yet firm, as he pressed Alara to consider reconciling with Cale for the sake of their church community's reputation. He repeated Cale's fabricated version of events to her, framing the arch collapse as a trivial minor accident, minimizing her 3 days of critical ICU confinement, painting Cale's flight to Lila's overdose emergency as a compassionate act of charity that deserved forgiveness rather than condemnation. The pastor explained multiple church families had reached out expressing discomfort with the scandal circulating their small town, worrying the public split would create division within the weekly congregation services. He suggested marriage counseling sessions as a middle ground, urging Alara to set aside her trauma and give Cale space to earn back her trust, arguing all relationships required overlooking grave mistakes to preserve social harmony within the church. Alara listened to his biased appeal in cold silence, stunned that the religious leader she'd looked to for comfort only cared about protecting the church's public image, with no empathy for her near-death experience or the months of hidden infidelity uncovered over the past week. Alara declined the counseling suggestion flatly, telling the pastor she could never rebuild trust with a man who abandoned her bleeding and injured on their wedding day to rush to another woman's side. The pastor's expression turned dismayed, warning her a hasty separation would label her a bitter, unforgiving wife within their tight-knit religious community, before leaving the waiting room without offering a single prayer or well-wish for her physical recovery. The encounter left Alara feeling isolated and abandoned by the community she'd attended faithfully. Another layer of support stripped away amid her ongoing. Tensions flared between Alara and Jessa later that noon, a rare fight ignited by Alara's lingering self-blame over the wedding. Alara had quietly admitted she couldn't stop replaying the thought that she'd pushed Cale into hiding the affair by demanding too much emotional stability and constancy, a line of thinking Jessa refuted. Jessa argued Alara was excusing Cale's deliberate cruelty to avoid the painful reality that he'd chosen infidelity and abandonment of his own. Raising her voice out of fear, Alara would sabotage her own healing by shouldering blame that did not. The argument ended with Jessa storming out of the hospital lobby leaving Alara alone with her discharge paperwork for an hour, trapped in a spiral of isolation with nearly every source of support temporarily pulled away. Once Jessa returned, calm and remorseful for raising her voice, the two women finished signing discharge forms and drove to a 24-hour roadside diner in town, hoping a quiet late-night meal might ease the heavy tension. Dr. Mara texted Alara mid-meal, offering to meet them at the diner to talk through her own past abandonment trauma, arriving 10 minutes later in her off-duty civilian jacket, free from hospital scrubs and professional medical boundaries for the first time since Alara's admission. Over lukewarm coffee and greasy diner French fries, Dr. Mara opened up about her first husband's identical pattern of emotional avoidance and prioritization of other women's crises over her medical emergencies. She detailed how she'd wasted 2 years attempting conciliation, convinced she could fix their broken marriage through endless compromise and self-sacrifice, only to realize her willingness to overlook betrayal left her perpetually vulnerable to further harm. Her candid personal story gave Alara the validation she'd been craving, solidifying the quiet friendship forming between patient and physician beyond their formal MIP. By the time they left after midnight, Jessa's temporary anger faded entirely, her protective loyalty to Allah stronger than ever, after witnessing how every institutional and family support system had failed over the past week. They climbed into Jessa's sedan and drove the familiar route toward the suburban home Alara and Cale had purchased together for the wedding, the driveway visible at the end of a tree-lined residential street as they corner. Alara stared at the front porch light glowing through the dark evening, dread. Every room inside the house held tangible reminders of lies. Hidden text receipts in desk drawers, hotel reservation slips buried in garage storage, furniture they'd picked out while he secretly planned to leave her post-wedding. She knew she could not spend a single night under that shared roof, surrounded by proof of the 6 months of deception that nearly cost her the wedding lawn. The front door of the marital home clicked open with a familiar key Jessa had held onto as a backup spare months prior, the stale, quiet air inside hitting Alara the second they stepped across the threshold. Sunlight filtered through floor-length living room curtains, illuminating every shared decoration they'd picked out together during weekend furniture shopping trips. The oak dining table they'd refinished side by side, framed wedding engagement photos lined along the fireplace mantel, built-in bookshelves filled with graphic design sketchbooks Alara had spent years creating for her small business studio. Every item carried a bitter double meaning now, tainted by Cale's secret promise to abandon the entire home and their planned future within 7 days of their wedding ceremony. Jessa set the canvas duffel bag holding Alara's hospital belongings down by the entryway closet, promising to remain nearby in her car, parked out front while Alara sorted through critical paperwork stored in her home office upstairs. Alara climbed the carpeted staircase slowly, pausing halfway to press a palm to her bandaged scalp when a faint migraine twinged behind her eyes. steadying herself on the wooden banister before continuing toward the small back bedroom converted into her design workspace. Her office desk sat pushed against the far wall, a locked wooden drawer built into its lower frame that Alara had avoided opening for nearly a year. Months before agreeing to the wedding, a family law attorney friend had drafted a simple prenuptial agreement outlining clear separation of Alara's fully self-funded graphic design studio and personal savings, protecting her business assets from being tangled up in Cale's unstable construction company debts if the marriage ever dissolved. Cale had pressured her relentlessly to discard the document, framing the prenuptial draft as a sign she did not fully trust their love or long-term commitment, and Alara had relented to keep peace, shoving the printed paperwork deep inside the locked drawer and forgetting its existence entirely amid wedding planning chaos. She retrieved a small brass key hidden beneath a stack of watercolor sketch pads on her desk surface, twisting it inside the drawer lock until the wood popped open with a soft click. Inside sat the folded prenuptial draft, still intact and unsigned, alongside bank statements tracking every personal deposit Alara had made to launch her design studio years before meeting Kyle. Irrefutable legal proof her business belonged solely to her, separate from any joint marital finances they'd opened after moving into the suburban home together. As she flipped through the printed legal page, Alara spotted scribbled notes from her attorney highlighting a critical clause. Assets owned and funded entirely by one spouse pre-marriage remained fully protected in the event of abandonment or proven marital infidelity, exempt from any asset division demands filed by the other partner during divorce proceedings. The discovery of the prenuptial draft ignited a sharp shift in Alara's, pulling her out of passive grief and pushing her toward deliberate, structured action to protect her livelihood and financial stability. She stacked the legal papers neatly inside a manila folder, grabbed every joint bank statement and construction business invoice she could locate scattered across the desk, and carried the full stack downstairs to Jessa's waiting Anne, determined to schedule an emergency consultation with a local female family law attorney first thing the following morning. The downtown law firm's conference room smelled of fresh printer ink and leather binders when Alara arrived for her appointment 24. The female attorney reviewing Alara's pre-draft, Cale's 6 months of evidence, medical records from the ICU trauma, and Lila's folder of text receipts with sharp focused attention. The attorney broke down Cale's financial scheme plainly, revealing his construction business carried roughly $28,000 in unpaid vendor debt he'd planned to resolve entirely using profits from Alara's thriving graphic studio, without disclosing the massive outstanding balance to Alara at any point throughout our engagement. The attorney filed an emergency temporary separation order mid-consultation, submitting formal paperwork to the county court to freeze all shared joint checking and savings accounts, bar Cale from entering the marital home property without a court-approved escort, and mark Alara's design studio as fully exempt from any future asset division claims Cale might attempt to file during divorce. By the time Alara left the law firm that afternoon, a legal barrier had been permanently erected between her and Kyle's attempts to drain her independent business funds to settle his personal business debts. As dusk settled over the neighborhood, Alara and Jessa returned to the marital home to pack a small suitcase of Alara's essential clothing and supplies, planning to temporarily stay in a short-term rental apartment downtown while divorce proceedings unfolded. They barely finished zipped suitcase closed when loud, heavy banging echoed against the front wooden door, followed by Cale's raised, furious voice shouting Alara's name through the wood panels. He screamed a chaotic mix of desperate apology, bitter threats, demanding Alara unlock the door and speak face to face, vowing he would not leave the driveway until she agreed to hear his side of the wedding incident. Alara stacked from the entryway, her hand steady as she clutched the signed temporary separation court paperwork the attorney had that afternoon, the legal document granting her full authority to refuse Cale entry to the shared property indefinitely. Clara Voss hosted a small backyard cookout at her suburban home the following weekend, inviting extended family, Kyle's construction business partners, and multiple mutual church acquaintances in a deliberate attempt to rebuild public sympathy for her son amid the town's rampant wedding scandal gossip. She'd called Alara 2 days prior to extend a half-hearted invitation, her tone stiff and unapologetic for her earlier defense of Cale, insisting Alara owed the family a chance to resolve their conflict in front of loved ones. Alara accepted the invitation with quiet purpose, packing every stack of documented evidence, Lila's folder of affair texts, Cale's unpaid construction debt invoices, hospital ICU medical records, and the prenuptial legal draft, inside a leather portfolio to bring to the cookout gathering. Jessa accompanied Alara to the event as her steady support system, parking her sedan a block down the residential street to avoid drawing immediate attention as they walked toward Clara's white picket fence front yard. The backyard hummed with casual conversation and the sizzle of hamburgers cooking on a charcoal grill when they stepped through the side gate, every guest's gaze snapping toward Alara the second she crossed the lawn. Whispered murmurs rippled through the group instantly, half the attendees shifting their weight uncomfortably, others shooting Cale sympathetic glances as he stood beside his mother near the grill, putting on a manufactured show of quiet heartbreak and regret for the crowd's benefit. Cale spotted Alara within seconds of her arrival, abandoning the grill tongs and crossing the lawn to intercept her before she could greet any other guest. He lowered his voice to a strained, pleading murmur, begging her to set aside their legal separation paperwork for the afternoon, and avoid airing private marital trauma in front of family and friends, claiming the cookout was his last chance to repair his shattered reputation within their small community. Ilara brushed past him without resting, walking straight to the wooden picnic table at the center of the yard and unzipping her leather portfolio, spreading every piece of documented evidence across the table surface for every guest to clearly view. A hush fell over the backyard as attendees stepped closer to scan the printed text screenshots, unpaid debt sheets, and hospital medical summaries detailing Ilara's 3 days of solitary ICU confinement. Cale's face drained her, his performative remorse vanishing instantly as panic set in, rushing forward to gather the papers off the table before anyone could process the full scope of his deception. Clara stepped between him and the table, holding him back with one firm hand on his arm, her eyes wide as she read the handwritten pre-wedding note promising Lila he'd leave Ilara within a week of their wedding. Midway through the tense backyard conversation, Cale's primary construction business partner pushed out, clutching a stack of overdue vendor invoices he'd attempted to discuss with Cale for weeks without. He laid the full $28,000 of outstanding debt paperwork on top of Ilara's bill, revealing Cale had repeatedly lied about paying construction bills, planning to siphon Ilara's design studio profits to settle the overdue balances without her knowledge or consent. The partner announced on the spot he would terminate their shared construction contract effective immediately, unwilling to continue working alongside a partner who hid crippling debt and manipulated his spouse's business income to cover his financial mismanagement. Lila sent an unsolicited voice note to Ilara's cookout, the audio loud enough for nearby guests to overhear when Ilara accidentally pressed play on speaker setting. Lila's shaky voice detailed months of Cale's constant manipulation, describing how he'd weaponized her anxiety to maintain their secret affair, lying to both women simultaneously to avoid accountability for his own cowardice and financial recklessness. Every fabricated excuse Cale had told the crowd that afternoon completely, as the voice note echoed across the quiet backyard lawn, leaving every attendee with unignorable proof he'd spent 6 months in a double life while planning to abandon Ilara immediately. Clara stood silent for several long minutes after the voice finished playing, staring at her son with a mix of sorrow and unmet. She turned to address the entire gathered group, issuing a public apology to Ilara for blindly defending Cale's reckless choices over the past 2 weeks, admitting she'd ignored clear signs of his lifelong avoidance and dishonesty to protect her image as a supportive mother. She told Cale plainly she could no longer excuse his abandonment of Ilara at the wedding or his hidden financial schemes, cutting off her unconditional support for his attempts to reconcile or salvage his local reputation within their community. The cookout dissolved shortly after Claire's disavowal, guests filing out one by one with cold, judgmental glances directly at Cale, the town's gossip narrative shifting entirely from sympathy for a broken groom to condemnation of a man who chose his mistress and unpaid debts. Ilara began gathering her stack of evidence papers to pack into her portfolio, when Cale pulled her aside into a quiet side garden hidden behind patio hedges, his manufactured remorse replaced with raw, unfiltered rage as he leaned in close to hiss a bitter threat only she could hear. If she pushed forward the full divorce settlement and fought to protect her design assets in court, he promised to launch targeted online negative reviews against her graphic design business, sabotaging every local client connection she'd built over years to ruin her livelihood and force her to concede to unfair asset division terms just to escape his harassment. The downtown family law firm's mediation conference room was cold and windowless, lined with neutral gray walls and a long polished oak table where Ilara, Cale, their respective attorneys, and a court-appointed neutral mediator sat across from one another for the official divorce settlement negotiation. 2 weeks had passed since the disastrous backyard cookout threat, and Ilara's legal team had compiled every piece of admissible evidence to counter Cale's attempts to sabotage her graphic design studio and claim a portion of her premarital business assets during asset division talks. A thick leather binder holding hospital trauma records, 6 months of affair text logs, unpaid construction debt invoices, Lila's recorded voice note, and the intact prenuptial draft sat centered on the table between them, visible to every person present in the room. Cale arrived with a sharp combative energy, his attorney opening negotiations by laying out his client's initial unfair demand, a 50-50 split of all joint and individual assets, including full access to Ilara's design studio revenue stream for the next 12 months to pay off his $28,000 in construction debt, and a temporary delay to the divorce, filing to allow Cale time to repair his local business reputation. The attorney repeated Cale's private threat indirectly during opening statement, hinting at potential reputational harm to Ilara's small business if they could not reach a compromise favorable to his client's financial needs. Ilara remained calm and steady through the opening demand, her own female attorney stepping forward to lay out Ohio's state family law statutes governing marital misconduct and spousal abandonment, citing clear legal precedent for full asset protection when one spouse abandons the other during a life-threatening medical emergency while maintaining a long-term extramarital affair. The attorney slid Ilara's full ICU medical records across the table to the meter, highlighting the 2 overnight medical code events and 72 hours of unassisted critical confinement following the wedding arch collapse, formalizing legal proof of Cale's catastrophic abandonment as actionable marital misconduct under state divorce rules. Cale grew increasingly defensive as the mediation session stretched, repeatedly interrupting Alara's attorney to rehash his tired excuses about Lila's overdose emergency, arguing his split-second decision to flee the wedding garden constituted an act of basic human decency that should negate any formal misconduct penalties during asset division. The mediator cut him off each time he attempted to redirect the conversation away from his documented 6-month affair and hidden business, forcing him to acknowledge every piece of printed evidence laid out in the central binder before the group. Alara spoke directly to Cale for the first time since the wedding day disaster mid-mediation, her voice quiet yet unshakable as she recounted the 3 lonely days she spent fighting for her life in the IU, while he prioritized Lila's the months of secret lies he'd woven into every shared moment of their engagement, and the handwritten pre-wedding note promising to abandon her within 7 days of exchanging marriage vows. She told him plainly she would never concede any portion of her design studio income to settle debts he'd hidden from her early, nor would she pause divorce proceedings to preserve a reputation he'd destroyed through his own deliberate choices. After 4 hours of tense back-and-forth negotiation, the mediator delivered a formal preliminary ruling based on Ohio's marital misconduct. Cale held no legal claim to any of Alara's premarital graphic design studio assets or personal things. All unpaid construction business debt remained solely his financial responsibility, and the temporary separation order barring him from the marital home would remain in effect through the full divorce dissolution process. The mediator added a formal legal warning to Cale's record, stating any deliberate online harassment or business sabotage target Alara's design studio would result in immediate civil court penalties and additional financial restitution owed to Alara for lost client revenue. Cale's shoulders slumped in defeat the second the mediator ruling, all his manipulative leverage and threats stripped away by binding family law and the mountain of documented evidence Alara's legal. His attorney advised him privately that pushing for a lengthy contested court trial would only lead to more public exposure of his affair, debt, and abandonment at the wedding, damaging any remaining chance he had to rebuild local professional or personal relationships within their suburbity. With no viable legal ground to stand on, Cale reluctantly agreed to sign the preliminary divorce settlement paperwork by the mediator, surrendering all claims to Alara's independent business assets and accepting full sole responsibility for his outstanding consent. He scrawled his signature across every page of the printed settlement stack without making eye contact with Alara once, his jaw tough bitter resentment as he slid the completed documents back across the oak table to the mediator for filing with the county court clerk's office. The mediation session concluded minutes after the final signature ended on the paperwork, stood from his chair, grabbed his jaw at the back of his seat, and walked straight out of the windowless conference room by apology, or Alara. The heavy conference room door shut behind him, sealing every legal and romantic tie between them permanently. Alara sat alone at the polished oak table for several quiet minutes after Cale left, her fingers brushing over the stack of signed divorce settlement papers before her. For weeks, she'd carried a tangled mix of grief, rage, and lingering uncertainty about what life would look like once the marriage formally dissolved. In that quiet mediation room moment, all conflict melted away, replaced by a quiet, unshakable sense of freedom she hadn't felt since long before she'd agreed to marry Cale. Autumn crispness hung in the downtown Ohio air 3 months after the mediation settlement signing. The wedding season long ended, and Alara fully settled into a small, sunlit one-bedroom apartment above a downtown art gallery, a 10-minute drive away from the suburban marital home she'd officially vacated weeks prior. She'd reopened her graphic design studio in a shared co-working space downtown, launching a women-focused creative collective offering discounted branding and design services to single, separated, and divorced female small business owners across their county. A project born directly from the trauma of nearly losing her livelihood to Cale's hidden debt and manipulative asset demands. Her head wound had fully healed, the persistent migraines fading to rare, mild twinges, and the medical team cleared her of all lingering traumatic brain injury symptoms during her final neurology follow-up appointment that month. Jessa, Dr. Mara, and Lila May coordinated a small private dinner gathering at a neighborhood bistro on a mild October evening, the 4 women forming a steady, supportive chosen family forged through shared experience of Cale's deception and emotional manipulation. Lila had completed independent anxiety therapy and quit her administrative role at Cale's construction company months prior, taking a new entry-level position at a downtown bookstore to rebuild a life entirely separate from his influence. The codependent cycle between them fully broke. Dr. Mara brought a bottle of crisp white wine to the table, raising her glass halfway through the meal to repeat her iconic ICU line in a soft, warm tone, this time as a quiet celebration, not a brutal vert, acknowledging Alara had held her own funeral for the naive bride who'd bled on the wedding lawn and stepped forward as a strong, self-reliant woman, unafraid to prioritize her own safety and peace. After dinner wrap-up, Alara invited the 3 women back to her apartment for a quiet bonfire in the small rooftop patio space connected to her yacht. A metal fire pit centered on the concrete rooftop, surrounded by folding plastic lawn chairs. She retrieved the sealed plastic hospital bag holding her blood-stained lace wedding gown from the closet, carrying it out to the fire pit and unzipping the clear casing to lay the torn, crimson-splotched dress flat across the stone edge of the pit. The white lace fabric still carried faint, dried brown bloodstains from the wedding arch collapse, Every frayed seam and ruined floral bouquet, a physical reminder of the false fairy tale marriage she'd spent months grieving and finally letting go of. One by one, the women tossed small handfuls of dry kindling into the pit, Ilara striking a wooden match to ignite the stack beneath the wedding gown. Flames curled upward to catch the lace within, the delicate fabric burning fast into soft gray ash as the bonfire crackled loud against the quiet evening sky. Ilara watched the gown disintegrate into embers without a singer. No lingering longing for the wedding day or the life she once. Imagine building with Kale quiet. Closure for the version of herself who'd spent years prioritizing a partner's comfort over her own survival self-worth. Midway through bonfire, a postal delivery notification pinged a phone. A thick, hand-addressed envelope slipped under her apartment. Inside sat a long letter, written in Clara Voss's neat cursive handwriting. A sincere, unreserved apology for her months of blind defense of Kale's cowardice and Clara explained she'd cut almost all contact with her son following the divorce, unable to reconcile his abandonment of Ilara at the wedding with the moral values she'd raised. Though she did not pressure Ilara to reconnect or rebuild their mother. The letter closed with a gentle wish for Ilara's lasting happiness and independence. No expectation of forgiveness or reconciliation attached. Ilara folded the letter neatly and tucked it inside a desk drawer later, turning her attention back to the roof bonfire as the last scraps of wedding lace dissolved into ash. Jessa passed her a warm mug of cider. Dr. Mara rested a gentle on her shoulder, and Lila a quiet, grateful smile. 4 women bound not marriage or blood, but by surviving the same man's endless lies and choosing to lift each other up through the aftermath of his destruction. The following afternoon, Ilara took a slow solo drive out to Wheat Gardens, the outdoor wedding venue where the steel arch had collapsed, and her marriage shattered. The broken metal decorative beam had been fully removed and replaced with a simple wooden floral trellis, white climbing roses regrown thick across its frame. The lawn neatly trimmed and cleared of every trace of that catastrophic summer wedding day. She parked her sedan at the edge of the parking lot, sitting quietly in the driver's seat for 20 minutes, watching couples stroll through the garden grounds for their own engagement photos, without a flicker of the crippling grief that had consumed her weeks earlier. She did not step foot out of the car to walk the lawn again. She did not need to. Every wound tied to the face had fully healed. Every lingering ghost of the abandoned bride laid to rest alongside the burned wedding gown on her rooftop bonfire the night before. By the time dusk painted the skies to peach and lavender, Ilara turned her sedan around and back toward downtown, the radio playing soft indie folk music through the speakers as she navigated the quiet county highway. Her final quiet thought mirrored the circular callback to Dara's ICU line, a gentle, unshakable promise she'd made to herself after months of recovery and hard-won independence. She'd never received the lifelong marital vows her youth dreaming of, but she'd finally sworn an unbreak to her own heart. She would never again anyone leave her bleeding, scared and completely alone to fight for her own life.